Okay, welcome Year 12 to the first lesson of utilitarianism. So this is the first ethical system that we'll be looking at. Um, okay, so let's get started. So what we have in front of us is a very, very simple explanation, a visual explanation of utilitarianism. So utilitarianism is sometimes called the happiness or the pleasure theory of ethics. And utilitarianism is quite simple. All it states is that in any ethical situation, you should perform the action that is likely to lead to the most happiness or the most pleasure for the greatest number of people. Okay, so here, this is good. Let's say you perform an action and it makes 3 people happy, but 1 person sad, then this is okay because 3 is more than 1. Now let's say you're in this situation where if you perform an action it makes 2 people unhappy but 1 person happy, then this is a bad action. So it's about the balance of pain versus pleasure. And any action which produces more pleasure than pain is a good one, and any action that produces more pain than pleasure is a bad one. Okay? So let's look at some keywords first of all. Utilitarianism is based on hedonism. Hedonism. And hedonism is the belief that pleasure is the highest good. The highest good. So utilitarianism sometimes talks about happiness and sometimes talks about pleasure. And strictly speaking, they're actually 2 quite different things, aren't they? Being happy and experiencing pleasure. So that is one AO2 issue that you can explore in your essay. Is happiness the same thing as pleasure? Most of the time with utilitarianism, particularly with Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism, who we'll be looking at this week, we're looking at pleasure. So pleasure is nice feelings, nice feelings. And if you're a hedonist, you believe that the sole purpose of life is to experience nice feelings. And you might think, well, that's a bit, I don't know, that's not quite true, or that's not right. What about love? Maybe love is the highest good. Well, the utilitarian would say, why is love good? Love is only good because it gives you pleasure. So this is what's meant by the highest good. You could equally say, well, maybe family is the highest good, or maybe religion is the chief or the highest good. But what's a utilitarian going to say? Family is only good, religion is only good because it produces pleasure. It makes you feel good. And if you didn't experience pleasure from these things, you wouldn't do them. So hedonism is the idea that the ultimate and the highest good, the reason we do anything at all, the reason we get out of bed in the morning and go to work or try and find a relationship that's meaningful, is because pleasure is what we seek. So hedonism means that we're pleasure-seeking creatures, and that's what we aim to do, and ethics should reflect that. Okay, utility. This is the word that utilitarianism gets its name from. And utility just means usefulness. Okay, so you might have heard of the word utility in the context of utility bills. Okay, gas, water, electric. And it comes from the same sort of idea. So gas, water, and electric are useful. They're useful. Okay, they're useful for running your home. And the same is true in ethics. Actions are only good or bad if they're useful. Useful for what? Well, useful for producing pleasure. And for this reason, the ethical theory is consequentialist. Actions aren't good or bad in themselves. They're only good or bad based on how useful they are for producing pleasure. Okay? And quantitative. So Jeremy Bentham's form of utilitarianism is quantitative. That means it's concerned with the quantity or the amount of pleasure produced. So an action is good if it leads to the highest quantity of pleasure. Now, Mill, John Stuart Mill, who is our other philosopher we're going to be looking at next week, he's still a utilitarian, but he believes in the quality of pleasure. So Bentham thinks that actions are good if they produce the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number. And Mill is also concerned with that, but he's more focused on quality. So there's better and there are worse pleasures to actually experience. Okay, so we have hedonism, utility, quantitative, and qualitative. So these are words that we're going to be using throughout this week's learning. Okay, so to further understand utilitarianism, let's look at a case study. Okay. In 2011, then President Barack Obama discovered where Osama bin Laden was living. Osama bin Laden, terrorist. He was responsible for the 9/11 attacks on New York. And he was head of Al-Qaeda, which is a terrorist organization which kills thousands, tens of thousands of people each year. So you could argue a very, very bad man. So Obama discovered where he was living. It was in northern Pakistan. And Obama had a choice. Should I kill Osama bin Laden? Should I send the Marines in and assassinate him? Now, does Barack Obama think that killing is good? Probably not, right? I mean, killing by itself probably isn't good or bad. If you kill an innocent person, that's bad. But in this situation, he worked out that killing was the best thing to do. And this was a very utilitarian decision. Killing Osama bin Laden obviously produces pain. It produces pain for Osama bin Laden, and it produces pain for his family. But it produces pleasure for so many people, far more people than the pain is being experienced by a select few. And so this was a very utilitarian decision, because killing Osama bin Laden makes the world more secure, means that people in the future who might be killed by terrorists won't be killed. It makes people happy because they know they've got revenge for 9/11. So Obama made the decision to order the killing of Osama bin Laden. Does Barack Obama think that killing is right? Does he think that ending life is a good thing? Well, the answer is probably not, right? Probably he doesn't think that killing is good. But in this situation, it led to more pleasure being experienced by more people. And therefore, this was a very consequentialist decision, a decision where the action that was taken might not be right, but the consequences outweigh the wrongness of the action. So this is a very utilitarian decision, and we see these sorts of decisions happening all the time, all the time. So was his action consequentialist or deontological? Well, obviously, it was consequentialist. Killing was acceptable in this situation because it led to a good outcome. So utilitarianism is a very consequentialist or teleological ethical system. So let's go back to its roots. Well, it actually has its roots in ancient Greek philosophy, in particular in Epicurus, who believed that the sole good was to minimize pain in the world. But modern day utilitarianism goes back to this figure, Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham lived between these years, 1748 and 1832. So he is an Enlightenment thinker. Enlightenment is an era in European intellectual thought where people rejected religion and rejected tradition and tried to build ethics and philosophy based on reason. So reason is very important for Bentham. And Bentham is not religious. So utilitarianism is not a religious system. In fact, it's very mathematical. It's based on reason, and it's based on the idea that pleasure should be pursued in this life. So Jeremy Bentham was so anti-religious that he actually asked for his body to not be buried. Remember, if you're a Christian, you believe that your body should be buried because of the resurrection of the dead. Bentham instead left his body to medical science. And that's a very utilitarian thing to do in itself, isn't it? He decided, in my death, which action is going to lead to the greatest amount of pleasure being experienced by the greatest number, burying my body so it rots in the grave, or leaving it to scientists who can experiment on it and maybe find cures for diseases that can then lead to the reduction of pain and the production of pleasure in the future. So this is Jeremy Bentham today. Okay, his body has been embalmed, which means it's been soaked like the pharaohs, the mummies of ancient Egypt. It's been soaked in oils so that it doesn't rot away. His head originally was embalmed. We can see it here, but it kind of rotted away. So this is a wax figure of his head. And this is in UCL, University College London, which is a university that many of you might be aspiring to go to. And the reason it's here is because Jeremy Bentham set up UCL. He founded it. And that's because he wanted universities to be open to all people. He believed if everybody got an education, this would lead to the most pleasure for the most people. So he founded this university that was open for all people, for all people. Okay, so quite an inspirational figure. So Jeremy Bentham was born in London into a wealthy family. He was very advanced from an early age. He started studying Latin at the age of 3, for example. He was quite visionary for equality and human rights. So he believed that all humans are equal. And he wanted to change the world and make the world a better place. And for this reason, he was an MP. He was a member of Parliament. And his life work really is not so much philosophy. It was more about radical social change. So Bentham believed in education for all. He believed in reforming poorhouses. He believed in helping people. He was quite visionary for his time. He's the inspiration for opening university access for students from all backgrounds. And for this reason, he's displayed in UCL. Okay, so Bentham is trying to really overhaul ethics and ethical systems. Remember, at his time, ethics had been based really on Christian grounds, deontological grounds, the idea of following what the church says and doing what the Ten Commandments says. So we could ask Bentham now, is there such a thing as a good action? Just pause the video for a second and just think about that to yourselves. Okay, so Bentham is a consequentialist. So in my mind, I think he would say there is no such thing as a good action. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is, for Bentham, no action is good or bad in itself. Remember the Ten Commandments, there are good and bad actions, don't kill. But for a consequentialist, actions aren't good or bad in themselves. They're only good or bad if they lead to good outcomes. And that depends on the situation. So let's think again about Barack Obama. He doesn't think that killing, ending life, is a good action. But in some situations, if it leads to a greater outcome, then it's a good thing. If you're killing a terrorist, that leads to a greater outcome, so that's a good thing. If you're killing an innocent child, then obviously that's not a good thing. So is killing by itself good or bad? Well, for Bentham, it depends on the outcome. Here's a consequentialist. So Bentham's central question is this, or central statement. Ethics should be concerned with happiness. That's what all people seek. Let's ignore religion. Let's ignore God, because Bentham was probably an atheist. What unites all people? What do all people aim for? Well, it's happiness. They want to live a pleasurable, happy existence. And so this is what ethics should be focused on. So Bentham thinks that the good equals happiness and happiness equals good. They're essentially the same thing. So if I say, oh, I had a good day today, what I'm really saying is I had a happy or a pleasurable day. Okay, and if I say that I'm feeling happy today or I'm feeling pleasure today, then what I'm saying is I'm feeling good today. They're the same thing. Happiness, pleasure, good, same thing. So this is a fact of human psychology for Bentham. Bentham just believes this is how humans work. Okay, so we can start analysing this and thinking about AO2 issues. So you might want to criticise Bentham and say, is what makes us happy always good? Just pause the video for a second and think of your own example. Maybe there is something that makes us happy that isn't good. And if we can think of this, then maybe we can actually contradict Bentham. So just pause the video and think about this now. Okay, so the example I've come up with is maybe taking drugs. It might make you happy, but that doesn't make it good. Or what about bullying? Bullying someone might make you really happy, but that doesn't make it good. So this is an area where we can criticize Bentham. Now, I'd like you to pause the video again, and can you think of Bentham's response to this? Because Bentham might have a counter-argument to this. Okay, so I think Bentham's counter-argument is that these things actually don't make us happy. Taking drugs might make us happy in the moment, but they actually lead to lots of unhappiness in the future, and therefore it's actually not good. Bullying someone might make us happy in the moment, but it might lead to us being unhappy in the future because we regret it, and it definitely leads to the person being bullied feeling unhappy. So Bentham might disagree with this and say, you've got to think about not just the moment, but also the future. Something might make you happy in the moment, but actually make you more unhappy in the future. So it might be wrong to say that these two things make us happy. They don't. Okay, so another AO2 question. Does what is good for us always make us happy? So pause the video again here and try and think of your own examples. Okay, so examples I've given are going to the dentist. Very good for you, but no one's happy to go to the dentist. Or going to school. Very good for you, but it might not make you happy. So have we just proven Bentham wrong? Well, pause the video again and think about what Bentham might say in his defense. Okay, so what I think Bentham would say is, going to the dentist doesn't make you happy in the moment, but it definitely makes you happy in the long run. Why is that? Well, because you've got teeth that aren't going to hurt you. If you don't go to the dentist, that's actually going to make you unhappy, because in the future you'll have bad teeth that cause pain. Going to school doesn't make us happy in the moment, maybe, but it definitely makes you happy, and more happy even, in the long run, because you're able to have a better life or, a better job. So I think Bentham could actually respond to these criticisms quite well. So this is something that you could write about in essays. Okay, so Bentham is concerned with this question: what actually is happiness, or what actually is pleasure? What makes a happy life? Well, Bentham says this: nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. So pause the video and think about this. What do you think this means? Okay, so what I think this means is Bentham is saying that naturally we are driven by these two things. We want to avoid pain and we want to experience pleasure. And this seems to be a basic fact of human psychology. There is a reason that you put a warm coat on when it's cold. There is a reason that you don't try and hurt yourself. Because you want to experience pleasure and avoid pain. And this is a basic fact of life. No one wants pain and everyone wants pleasure. And so Bentham says this is so basic that this is what we should be trying to do when we make ethical decisions. We should be trying to increase pleasure and decrease pain. So happiness and therefore the good equals the absence of pain and the presence of pleasure. So lots of people forget this about utilitarianism. They think that utilitarianism is focused on pleasure. But it's not just pleasure, it's also the absence of pain. Pain, bad. Pleasure, good. It's quite a simple theory, really. And what he means by two sovereign masters, well, sovereign means the king or queen, the highest authority. And what I think he means by this is there are lots of things that are good in our life, like religion and family and love and Netflix. But why do you chase these things? Would you watch Netflix if it brought you pain? No. The only reason you do any of these other things is for pleasure and the avoidance of pain. So they are the highest masters. They are what control our lives. Okay? So utilitarianism, very simply, good equals pleasure, bad equals pain. Okay? Now let's make it a little bit more sophisticated. It's not just the absence of pain and the presence of pleasure, because it's not just you. Ethics involves everyone. So, happiness and therefore the good equals the absence of pain and the presence of pleasure for the greatest amount or number of people. Okay? So, situation A on the left is good because we've got 3 people experiencing pleasure and 1 person experiencing pain. It's bad, obviously, that 1 person experiences pain, but it's outweighed by the pleasure. 3 to 1. On the right, we've got 1 person experiencing pleasure, which is good, but 2 people experiencing pain, which outweighs the pleasure. 2 to 1. Therefore, it's bad. Okay? So this is the principle of utility. The classical version of utilitarianism is usually attributed to Bentham, who discovered the idea of the greatest good of the greatest number. He named this the principle of utility. In any ethical situation, just think about what produces the greatest pleasure for the greatest number. This is why it's called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism. Usefulness. The correct action is the action which is the most useful for producing the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number. And also the least amount of pain for the greatest number. Don't forget pain. Okay, so Bentham's theory plays into human nature with a democratic twist. It's democratic because it's focused on the greatest number of people experiencing it. And the more people experiencing it, the better. So it's focused on the happiness of the community. So it's the sum total of pleasure experienced by as many people as possible. So we can actually put it into a mathematical formula. And you might like to play around with this at home. This is the formula. Utility, or the useful action, equals pleasure divided by pain times by the number of people. And that gives a score. So we can work this out now. There are 11 people in the room. Okay, this is our ethical example. If I bring in a cake, I have two options. A, eat the cake myself. B, share it out. So pause the video now. Using this equation, can you work out the utility of this action and the utility of this action, and then work out which one has the highest utility? Remember, utility is pleasure over pain times number of people equals score. Okay, so pause the video now, please. Okay, so let's work this out. Okay, so if I eat the cake all to myself, well, let's try and work this out. This is one of the hard things about utilitarianism, is how do you actually quantify or work out what pleasure is? So we're going to have to take a few guesses here. So let's say I eat the cake all by myself. Let's say I experience 10 slices of cake. So that's 10 bits of pleasure. 10 bits of cake slice pleasure. Lovely. Pain. Well, here we go. We've got the pain of the other 10 people in the room who are missing out on the cake. So let's say they have 10 bits of pain. Also, we have the pain of me maybe being sick. So let's say that's maybe 5 bits of pain. So 10 over 15. 10 divided by 15 times the number of people. Well, the number of people experiencing this is just me. I'm the only one experiencing pain or pleasure from the cake. So actually, let's forget about the other people. Let's just focus on this. 10 bits of pleasure for me having cake, but 5 bits of pain for me feeling sick, times one person. So 10 divided by 5 is 2 times 1. The score comes out as 2. Okay, now let's imagine that we share the cake out. Okay, the pleasure, let's think about individuals. The pleasure is going to be lower, isn't it? Because they're only getting one slice of cake, not the whole thing. So one slice of cake, one bit of pleasure. No pain, because everyone's having one slice, so they're not going to get sick. But times by the number of people equals 11. So we have worked out that the action which produces the most pleasure for the most or the greatest number of people is sharing the cake. That means there's 11 bits of pleasure in the room versus 2 bits of pleasure in the room if I eat the cake myself, because it's outweighed by the pain of being sick. Okay, now let's think about the pushing the fat man off the bridge. So again, pause the video. Okay, so we have two choices. Let's say we push the fat man off the bridge. Okay, pleasure. The pleasure is going to be 5 people whose lives are saved. The pain is going to be 1 person who dies. Okay, times the number of people. Oh, actually, I think I've done this incorrectly. Let's think about the pain versus the pleasure here, actually, of individuals. So let's say, pushing the fat man off the bridge, let's focus on the fat man. Experiences no pleasure, and let's say he experiences 1 bit of pain, times 1 person equals score of 1. Now let's say we don't push the fat man off the bridge. Well, we've got the pleasure of 1 person, the fat man, because he doesn't die. But then we've got the pain of 5 people because they're getting hit by the train. Times 5 people, 1 over 5, it's a higher score. It's not an exact equation, so we're going to find it a little bit tricky. And this is one of the AO2 issues, is that it's actually hard to work out. But you get the general idea. So I might have not done that completely correctly, but you get the general idea. In both cases, the situation says, share the cake and push the fat man off. That's what leads to the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number. Okay, so let's look at an opening paragraph. Utilitarianism is a normative, that means it tells us what we ought to do, consequentialist ethical theory. This means it tells us what we ought to do, and this is to produce the most amount of pleasure for the most amount of people, or the highest amount, the greatest number. So the grammar's not very good there, sorry. This is known as hedonism. For a utilitarian, the correct moral action is based entirely upon the pleasure produced. Bentham set out 2 sovereign masters. These are pain and pleasure. There is only one absolute good, and this is the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain. So, for example, if there was a man who wished to be allowed to die to reduce pain, then a utilitarian would perform the action that is the most useful for producing the most amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people, and may allow him to. This is why the theory is called utilitarianism. Actions are not inherently good or bad. They are only useful relative to an outcome for the production of pleasure. This is known as the principle of utility. Okay, so hopefully you understand it at this point. Let's have a quick summary. Utilitarianism, classical utilitarianism devised by Bentham, is about maximizing utility, the greatest good for the greatest number. It's very democratic, considers all persons involved, considers short and long-term benefits as well. And you need to find the one action which maximizes utility. Okay. So Bentham states that humans are motivated by pleasure, principle of hedonism. We are placed under the governance of 2 sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. Okay, you may disagree with this. This is something you can discuss in essays. So you may say, yes, we don't like pain. We do like pleasure. That's human nature. We can see that with our eyes. Even religious people, you might say, are governed by this because they want the pleasure of heaven and avoid the pain of hell. So you might argue that religious people are utilitarians in their own way. You might disagree. No, sometimes pain doesn't lead to unhappiness. Sometimes we want pain, such as the pain of going to school or going to the dentist or training for a marathon. Counter-argument to that is Bentham would say, well, we're not really seeking pain then, we're seeking pleasure. It's just that pain is the way of achieving that pleasure. We want the pleasure of running a marathon, that sense of achievement, the pleasure of going to school and getting good grades, the pleasure of having teeth that aren't going to cause you pain. We might also disagree and say some people experience pleasure through pain. Some people like pain, because they experience pleasure. So maybe some people seek pain. Again, Bentham's answer to this would be, well, if they're experiencing pleasure through pain, then actually they are trying to get pleasure. It's just that pain helps them get pleasure. Okay. So utilitarianism, utility principle, moral value of the action depend on the amount of pleasure and pain. Less pain, more pleasure for more people. That's why Bentham's utilitarianism is quantitative. Bentham doesn't care about the quality of pain versus pleasure, and that's going to be a criticism that Mill is going to address in our lessons next week. Okay, Bentham's theories led to extensive social reform affecting Parliament. So Bentham was really concerned about passing laws. He was an MP, and he wanted to pass laws that gave people more rights and gave people access to things that could maximize pleasure. So traditionally in Parliament, people were only really concerned with their own representatives, or sorry, their own constituents. So they were only concerned with the rich or the people who would vote them into power. But Bentham said we should focus on all the people, very democratic. Okay. So Bentham is an act utilitarian. And that just means in any situation, you should perform the action that must fulfill the principle of utility, lead to the greatest pleasure for the greatest number, and any action is acceptable. Hedonistic means pleasure, teleological means outcome is focused on. Now, you're going to be applying utilitarianism to business ethics, so to ethical behavior in business. So let's look at a case study. So let's look at globalization. Globalization refers to economies and industries and markets becoming more integrated. So, for example, Coca-Cola selling their products abroad, or Primark making the clothes in places where the labor is cheaper. One of the main examples of this is countries such as the UK or USA moving their production to lower wage countries such as India or China. So Primark, clothing store, it makes its clothes in lots of countries, mainly countries where the wages are very low. And this is so that you can sell your clothes for cheaper, because the overheads that it costs to make the clothes are less. This has led to some really bad situations. So in 2013, the Rana Plaza, which is a building complex in Bangladesh, collapsed, and it killed all its workers. Primark was using this building. One of the reasons that it collapsed was because Primark and other retailers didn't pay the workers very much and didn't pay the factory bosses very much. And because of that, they couldn't really afford to keep the building in a good, safe order. So you could argue that it's our fault, the people who shop at Primark. We demand cheap clothes, and because of this, people die. Pros and cons of globalization. Well, it does bring money to these countries, and they are quite good jobs compared with some of the other jobs that are around in these countries. It also provides cheap clothes, but then it does exploit people as well, and it leads to death. Okay, so we can think about some pros and some cons here, and you can just read through this quickly now. Okay, so we need to think about what an act utilitarian would say was the correct thing to do. We've got two choices: allow globalization or don't allow globalization. Which one leads to the greatest pleasure being experienced by the greatest number? So Bentham's utilitarianism, we know this is act utilitarianism because it looks at the balance of every action. individuals should make decisions in individual situations. So people in Primark should say, which decision leads to the greatest amount of pleasure? Okay, one major benefit of act utilitarianism is that it looks at every unique situation. Okay, it ignores rules. It's also quantitative. So Bentham's utilitarianism is about the amount of pleasure. So when it comes to globalization, how would Bentham work out which action produces the greatest amount of pleasure? Well, it's through something called the hedonic calculus. And this is a system that Bentham invented. And let's look at the words. Hedonic means pleasure, and calculus means calculator. So he invented the pleasure calculator. Now, this isn't a computer because computers didn't exist then. This is just 7 steps that you have to go through. Okay, the 7 steps look like this. They're on this graph here. Okay, 7 steps. And our acronym for remembering this is FRED IPC. And the 7 steps are fecundity, remoteness, extent, duration, intensity, purity, and certainty. So let's go through all of these steps. Let's start with the first one, which is fecundity. So the fecundity of an act is the likelihood that the pleasures or pains that it causes will be followed by similar pleasures or pains. So Bentham is concerned about not just pleasure happening straight away, but will it lead, like a chain reaction, to more pleasure? So if the happiness that an act causes is likely to be followed by yet more happiness, then that act is better than a similar act that will cause only one isolated instance of happiness. Remember, utilitarianism is about pleasure and pain, so similarly, if the pain that an act causes is likely to be followed by still more pains, then that act is worse. Okay? So, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and think to yourself, which action creates a pleasure that is more likely to repeat itself? Allowing the Primark to have globalization and to create these sweatshops, or not allowing it. So option A is creating sweatshop. Sweatshop is this, where the workers here are sweating. That's why it's called sweatshop. Or B, don't create sweatshop. So pause the video and think about it. Okay, so this is kind of tricky, isn't it? And this is a criticism of utilitarianism, is it becomes quite complicated. How do you work this out? There's so many people involved. Okay, so which action creates a pleasure that's more likely to repeat itself? Well, let's look at creating the sweatshop first. If you buy something from Primark, that's going to give you the pleasure of having those clothes. Is that pleasure going to repeat itself in the future? Well, you might say no, because as soon as you've worn something from Primark, it kind of falls apart. How long do you appreciate a new garment from Primark? Maybe a day, maybe 2 days? But then you could say, well, it gives you the pleasure of going back there over and over and over and over and over again. Okay, so that's the pleasure, or the fecundity of the pleasure of creating the sweatshop. Now let's look at the fecundity of the pain of creating the sweatshop. So this is this corner. So, paying the workers a low wage, is that going to lead to greater amounts of pleasure that repeat themselves in the future? Well, it could do, because they have more jobs. They can pay for their housing and their children. But it might also create pain, because they could get really physically hurt. And that introduces loads of pain that repeats itself in the future. Okay, so let's look at don't create the sweatshop. That's our other option. Well, that destroys any fecundity of enjoying clothes in the future. But it also destroys any fecundity of pain being experienced in the future as well. So it becomes quite complex. And when it comes to this, only you, because you're going to have to write about this in the exam, only you can make the decision here. Which one do you think? Which one do you think is going to lead to the highest fecundity, repeated pleasures in the future? And again, this is another criticism of utilitarianism, is it's so hard to work out. You can't predict the future and you can't quantify all the variables. Okay, so that's fecundity. Next, we have remoteness. Remoteness is concerned with how distant are the benefits of each possible course of action. The closer the pleasure in time and in space, the better. What that means is, let's say I'm going to give you a chocolate bar. If I give you a chocolate bar now, that's better than me giving you a chocolate bar in a month, because the pleasure is closer. Also distance. If I give you the chocolate bar right away, or if I post it to you and it arrives in another country and you have to go there and get it, obviously me giving you the chocolate right here, right now is better. So the more distant the benefits in either space or time, the less weight we should give them in making our decision. We should consider the pleasurable action which is closest in space or time. Okay, pause the video and think about this. Which action is going to produce a pleasure or a lack of pain that's closer in space and time? Creating the sweatshop or not creating the sweatshop? Okay, and again, you're going to have to make this decision because it's so complex. For example, if you create the sweatshop, that might produce pleasure straight away for people who can shop in Primark. They can get clothes straight away. And the pain experienced is by people who live far away, so maybe it doesn't matter. If you don't create the sweatshop, though, maybe people don't experience pleasure straight away. But then there's people in other countries who are not going to experience pain straight away. So again, this is your decision to make, and it's so complicated. This is one of the reasons that people highly criticize utilitarianism. Next, we have extent. This means the more people who enjoy the pleasure, the better. So if I give a chocolate bar and 3 people experience it, that's better than a chocolate bar that only 1 person experiences. So this is one that is quite simple. So again, pause the video. Which action is going to produce more pleasure or less pain for more people? Creating the sweatshop or not creating the sweatshop? Okay, so if you create the sweatshop, you might argue that it produces loads of pleasure, right? Because you've got all these thousands of people shopping at Primark. But then you've got to factor that in with the pain of all these people working. But then you've got to factor that in with the fact that you're going to have fewer workers than you are consumers. So the consumers who experience the pain might outweigh the workers who experience the pleasure. And if you don't create the sweatshop, there's going to be no one experiencing pleasure, but also no one experiencing pain. But then they also get pleasure of having a wage. So again, it's very, very complicated, and you're going to have to make a decision here. Okay, next, duration. This is concerned with which action produces the longest lasting pleasure or the least longest lasting pain. So if I give you a chocolate bar or I give you a PlayStation game, obviously the PlayStation game is going to give you pleasure for longer than the chocolate bar. Okay, so which one? Again, pause the video. Okay, so this is quite complex again. You could argue that the pleasure that you get from a new pair of jeans doesn't really last that long, but the pain of these people, especially if they lose a finger in the factories, is quite long lasting. So maybe creating the sweatshop is not the right thing to do. but don't create a sweatshop is the most utilitarian thing to do. Again, it's your decision. You've got to make this choice. Okay, next step, intensity. The intensity of the pleasure caused by an act. The more intense the pleasure, the better. So if I give you a chocolate bar, or you get a star in your GCSE, which one do you think is going to be more intense? Okay, obviously the A star. So more intense pleasure is better, according to Bentham. So pause the video again. Which option is going to produce intense pleasure or lack of intense pain? Okay, and again, I think this one says don't create the sweatshop, because the pleasure that you get from getting a new pair of jeans isn't that intense, but the pain that you get from working these long hours is quite intense. So maybe this means that you shouldn't create the sweatshop. So again, it's your choice. Okay, the next one I'm going to introduce to you by just talking about orange juice for a second. Which one has the purest orange juice? On the left, there's 70% orange juice and 30% water. And on the right is 50% orange juice and 50% water. So just think about that. Okay, obviously it's this one. So purity is the idea of undiluted pleasure, undiluted by pain. So the best way of viewing it is thinking about orange juice. Which one has the purest pleasure? The action that produces 3 people that are happy and 1 person who's in pain, or the action that produces 1 person who's happy and 2 people who are in pain? Just like the orange juice, it's obviously this one. This is the purest pleasure because it's diluted by only 1 bit of pain, whereas this is 1 bit of pleasure diluted by 2 bits of pain. So this is what purity means. An act that causes only pleasure is better than one that causes the same amount of pleasure mixed with a little pain. When pleasure or pain are unmixed with their opposites, the purity is higher. When they're mixed, the purity is diminished. So which action is going to create a pleasure that is least diluted with pain? Okay, pause the video. Okay, and this is so complicated. Well, look, the pleasure of getting a pair of jeans is diluted massively by the pain. So maybe you shouldn't allow the sweatshop. Okay, and you can think about this in your own way because there are other ways of looking at this. It's very subjective. Okay, and last step, certainty. This is quite simple. Certainty refers to the probability of pleasure resulting from the act. How likely is it that the act will bring about pleasure? If we must choose between an act that will definitely cause pleasure and one that might only possibly produce pleasure, then what should we do? So for example, if I know you like chocolate, and I don't know someone else likes chocolate, who should I buy chocolate for? Well, the answer is I should buy chocolate for the person who I'm certain is going to get pleasure from it. The other person might not get pleasure. Okay, so how certain are we? And you need to perform the action that is the most certain. So which action is the most certain, more likely to lead to the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain? Creating the sweatshop or not creating the sweatshop? So just think about that to yourself. Okay, this again is very, very complicated. Well, if you create Primark, you might not be certain that people will like the clothes, but you'll be pretty certain that people are in pain. But if you don't create the sweatshop, you're going to be certain that no one's going to experience the pain of the clothes. But how certain are you that people aren't going to suffer? Probably pretty high. So maybe don't create the sweatshop is the right answer. Okay, 7 steps. It's deliberately 7 because that way you can come up with a certain answer. Okay, because it's an uneven number, so it's never going to be a tie break. So this is how it works then. Okay. F, fecundity. Which action is most likely to lead to more pleasure in itself? Allow sweatshop or not allow sweatshop? I would say this means you don't allow the sweatshop. Because once the shoes have been bought or the jeans have been bought, it's difficult to see how the pleasure will be reproduced. Okay, so it comes up with no on this step of the calculus. R, remoteness. Which action will produce a pleasure or absence of pain that's closest in space and time? Allow the sweatshop. I'm saying no here as well, because the pleasure seems quite far away. You could make these jeans for market probably in 6 months' time, whereas the pain is quite near for these workers. E, extent. Which action will create a pleasure or lack of pain for the greatest number? And I said maybe allow the sweatshop in this case, because more people will be experiencing the pleasure of going to Primark than will be experiencing the pain of working at Primark or working to create shoes for Primark. So this one is the opposite. D, duration. Which action will produce a pleasure or lack of pain that lasts the longest? Well, I'd say this says no, you don't create the sweatshop, because the pleasure of a new pair of shoes is quite short, but the pain of losing a finger or your loved one dying in the Rana Plaza is quite high. I, intensity. Which action will create the strongest pleasure or the strongest pain? And I think this means don't allow the sweatshop. The pleasure gained from a new pair of shoes is not very intense, but the pain caused in making them is quite intense. P, purity. Which action will create the pleasure less diluted with pain? I think this means don't allow the sweatshop, because pleasure gained by one person's shoes is massively diluted by the pain of all the people who had to make it. And finally, C, for certainty. Which action is more likely to produce pleasure or a lack of pain? I would say, yeah, allow the sweatshop, because the company are fairly certain that it's going to produce pleasure. Okay, so let's work this out. What do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 no's versus 2 yeses. So the utilitarian decision is don't make the sweatshop. It doesn't lead to the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number versus the greatest amount of pain for the greatest number. Okay, and these are the steps. Very good. So you can pause this video now. This is another quick opening paragraph in an essay on utilitarianism. Okay, and here is a paragraph which explains some steps of the calculus, so you can pause this. And another paragraph. And another paragraph. Okay, so that's the end of the utilitarianism lesson. You can probably see lots and lots of weaknesses, and we're going to look at that. And that's because we're looking at utilitarianism over 2 weeks. So we'll be looking at it again next week, and that's where we'll really explore the criticisms. Okay, so thank you very much. And I will speak with you next week.